you going to like submit all, upload all these videos?
Yes. Yeah, they'll all be posted. All right, everyone, go ahead and get started. Hopefully everyone is caught up from last week if you were not here before. All we did was basically draw some things to the screen and get everything set up. So I would suggest opening up Eclipse and making sure that you can run your program before we get started. Make sure that there's no problems with Gradle. Hopefully, if there is anything, just start up with whatever computer you were on last week, and that should get everything working. If you forgot about the website, you can go up here to see all of the slides, and you can go along with me. And then also, if you guys need any help, we have 2 helpers again, so just raise your hand, and they'll be able to help you out. So this is where we left off. We kind of got into some very basic drawing to the screen where we have our character object who has gravity applied to him, and if you decided to do the last slide, he should be bouncing. If not, he should just stick to the ground. Either one's okay. So what we're going to talk about today is there's no point to a game if you can't control it. So you don't want to watch a movie, you want to actually be able to interact with it. So one of the first things that we're going to start is actual key input, so allowing your keyboard to control the game. And the same logic applies to, like if you have an Xbox controller, you can control it with that. If you have a touch screen, like if you want to make an Android game, all of this follows through. So it's not just your keyboard. So the way that games typically check if anyone's pressing something is using a thing called a listener. And a listener is basically, it's on the next slide. It's a separate class usually that executes code when you do something. Okay, so a listener is not necessarily input. It can be a lot of different things. So this is something that's a brand new concept, and it usually is very specific to interactive applications. So this is basically a basic kind of layout of how a listener works. It kind of runs alongside of your program, and here's your game. You've got all of your update and game stuff, and then you've got these kind of 2 methods here, which are going to happen when a user presses a key and when a user lets go of your key. So your listener kind of runs alongside, and it basically just stares at your keyboard and waits for someone to press something. And when you press something, it's going to say, hey, you pressed a key, so I'm going to run this code here. And then the same thing happens for when you release it, is as soon as you release a key, your listener goes, oh, they let go of a key, I'm going to call this method. So that is the basic layout of how something works. So it kind of runs alongside of it, which means that you have to do a little bit of handling on the side. So to start out, we're going to create our listener object. So do this in the exact same way that we created our character object, which is by right-clicking on the core file, then going to New and selecting Class, and then name it something that has to do with a listener. Hopefully it's got the word listener in it, otherwise you might confuse yourself. If you guys are having any problems getting this far, raise your hand. We'll have some help for you. Is everyone set? Okay. So now the next thing to do is we need to basically tie it into libgdx. So libgdx has a general listener that's called an input processor. So just add this little line here that says implements input processor, where the I and the P are capital. So this is a built-in class to libgdx. And it's going to give you an error because it says that it doesn't know what an input processor is yet. And that's because we're about to tell it. All right, so if you have that little squiggly underline thing, you can just import it like you have anything else. So if you guys are used to having scanners and it says that it doesn't know what a scanner is, and you import java.util.scanner, the same concept goes to this. So if you kind of like hover over the like underline that's there, you can hit import and it will like automatically add this line of code for you. It says import com.badlogic.gdx.input processor. So you don't actually have to type that in, just hover over it and hit import. So as soon as you fix that error, like a typical program, it gives you another error. And if you guys have not done abstraction before, that is completely fine. But what this is basically doing is it's telling us that we have a layout for input processor, and it needs to know how to interact. So it's going to tell you that there's unimplemented methods. So if you're in Eclipse, it makes it easy because you just hover over this, and then click on Add Unimplemented Methods. And as soon as you do that, it's going to make you a big file. Once again, if you guys need help, just raise your hand. So yeah, it generates a lot of methods here, and you don't have to know what pretty much any of them do. If you want to look through the names, though, they're pretty interesting. There's touch up, touch down, scrolled, mouse moved, but the biggest ones that we're going to work on are just your keyboard. So there's two real functions here, which is key down and key up. Anything that you decide to leave how it is default, it will just do nothing. If you notice, it just says like return false, return false. So technically, every time that you touch the screen, it's going to call your touch screen method, which just returns right away. So here's kind of our basic layout of what the listener is. We've only got these two things that we're caring about. And as soon as you press a key, that key down function will get called. And as soon as you let go of a key, the key up will be called. So using that, we can do a lot of things. So if you guys go to the top of the class, so right under the public class thing, make a variable. It's just a Boolean. We're just going to check if a key is being pressed. So make a variable, call it whatever you want. We're going to get rid of it real soon, so you can name it whatever you want. And just set it to false by default. So now our goal is to, when you press a key, that will become true. And then when you let go of it, it should become false again. Very simple. Is everyone all set? All right, so we're just going to leave it at that for now. Now if you jump back over to jelly.java or whatever you decided to name your game, now we need to tell our game to use this listener that we just created. Otherwise, we created something that has nothing to do with our game. So we're going to include it. So in the same way that we created our character object up at the top of the game, we're going to create our listener object. So whatever you decided to name your listener, mine was called my first listener, which is a little bit of a lie, then give it a variable name. All right, and then after you create your object, we need to initialize it so it doesn't stay null. So you can do that right in our create function, which if you remember, this is the part that gets called as soon as your program starts up. So this will only get called once. So this first line does the exact same thing as like what our character does. We're just creating it so it's not null. And then this second one is kind of something that's going to look a little foreign to you. You only have to do it once. I don't have this memorized. I just look it up whenever I need to add it. But basically what this is doing is telling libgdx to use a specific input processor. And that input processor is the thing that we just created, called keyboard listener. So that is telling libgdx that every time you press a key, to look to our key listener and have it handle it rather than doing nothing. Does anybody need more time on this? Yes. Good job. Still good. Oh, stretch. Gotcha. This guy. Start. I want to put it. Get this all set up. And then you pass in your keyboard listener. Is everybody all set? Oh. So you guys have probably seen this little GDX thing a couple of times. We've got GDX.input, and if you look in the draw section, you'll see GDX. Like GL stuff. So that's basically accessing your engine. So there's a lot of complicated things that does, but I think these are the only two times that we ever do GL dot something or GDX dot something. All right, so now the last thing is now we have this key listener, which has a variable in it called a key is pressed. So now anywhere in our game, we can use that to our advantage. So if you go into your character object, no, that's a lie. Don't do that. Go into your render. So this is still on your jelly.java file. We've got our character.update, which applies gravity to our character. And now if you go right before that, we can check if you're hitting a key. And the way that you do that is by saying your keyboard listener, and then hit dot, and then it brings up all of the properties of your keyboard listener. So in there we have our file, or our variable called a key is pressed. Also, you guys may have seen, this is technically a Boolean, so sometimes people like to write equals equals true, so that way if it's true, but technically a Boolean is also true, so just by leaving that there, it does the exact same thing. We're just checking if that value is true. And if it is, then we're going to do something. And just for now, something easy to change is setting our character's velocity to 5. So what that does is it kind of makes them jump. Because if you remember, velocity down means that they're falling, and we're adjusting that with gravity. If we say velocity is 5 upwards, as soon as you hit a button, it's basically going to make him fly up a little bit. And also feel free to mess around with that number, because it depends on what computer you're using. That'll make it do something. Oh, did I ever tell you to... Hold on, I think I missed something in here. Ah, yes, I should have put little things around that. There's 2 more lines here. I didn't tell you to change a button is pressed. So if you did not do these 2 lines right here, make sure that you add them. So as soon as you have the key down method, it should set that variable to true, and when you let go, it should set it to false, because if you don't have those, then it will always be false. What was that?
You told those.
I did? All right, does anybody still need this? Or did you guys get it? Because I totally missed over it. All right, so yes. Hopefully what happens now is, oh, and one more thing is if your character is bouncing, you might want to take out the bouncing, otherwise it'll be tough to figure out. But hopefully when you press any key on your keyboard, he should jump. And if you hold it, he should continuously fly upwards. Is anybody having troubles with this? Yes.
Is that supposed to be like that? Oh, here you go back. Michigan Tech.
If you guys are having problems with your character flying off the screen, that's because of one of 2 things. Either your gravity is set too low, so it's kind of like he's moon bouncing, or your jumping, that number that we entered 5, might just be too high. You might just be flinging him up really, really fast. So
How much do you have your velocity?
I don't know what I have mine set at, actually. I think I have, if you guys are wondering, I think I have gravity set to 0.05, and then when you press a button, I think it sets it to 5 upwards. So I think yesterday, or last week, I said 0.01 for gravity. You might want to increase that a little bit. And feel free to play around with those numbers, whatever seems like it works best. 9.81. Physics, whatever. Yep. God, oh. All right, so now applying that same logic, we can check if a specific key is being pressed. So we don't have to, I mean, it's not fun to just smash on your keyboard any key to have it all do the same thing. So we're able to check what key is being pressed. So luckily, if you guys noticed, there's a variable that's being passed inside of this key pressed method, or key down and key up. So that key code is what lets us distinguish what key is being pressed. So when you press the A button, it's going to tell us a button is pressed, and then if you're wondering what one it is, it'll have a key code of basically the A key. So now these numbers don't mean really anything in general. The key code is just a number that maps to your keyboard. So to start out, we're going to distinguish between the left and right arrow keys. So create 2 more booleans up at the top of your character. Also, we're done with the A key is pressed. A key is pressed, so you can feel free to get rid of that if you want. If not, it's not going to hurt to have it in.
Really? So he did create press and class level listener.
Okay, so if you guys have these 2 things added, now in the same way that we had before, we were just, when you press any key, it was setting a key is pressed to true. We don't just want to blindly set it to true. We want to only set it to true if that's the key that's being pressed. So there's this magical thing called keys, which basically lets you map up things so you don't have to memorize the key codes. If you really want to, they're all numbers. It's an integer. So you could type in, like, if keys pressed is 41. But it's a lot easier to read your code if key code equals keys.left and key code equals keys.right. So all this is doing a quick check. If the key code for this thing being passed in is left, so basically if we're pressing the left key, we're going to set our left arrow pressed to true. And if it's not, then we can do another check. If the key code is keys.right, so if we're pressing a key and it's our right key, then we'll set our variable right arrow pressed to true. And then in the same way for key up, do the same checks. So if we released our left key, set our left arrow pressed to false, and if we released our right key, set right arrow to false. Does anybody need more time on this slide? Everyone's all set. If you get a little bit behind, feel free to raise your hand. All right, so now we just created those 2 variables, and we're going to actually use them. So before, where we had our jumping, which was basically when you press any key, make them up. You can get rid of that line of code because we're not going to use that anymore. We're just going to make him move left and right. So now, in here, you can just do the same check as before. So we've got our keyboard listener, which is that thing watching our keyboard, which now has 2 variables, which is if the left key is being pressed and if the right key is being pressed. So in our game now, we can check if our left button is being pressed, we can make him move left. If our right button is being pressed, make him move right. So now if you guys can think back to what the character is, we defined some variables for him, which was like x, y, velocity, and gravity. So the x position is where he's being drawn on the screen, the y position is his height. So you can modify those in any way. So all I'm doing is setting this to be 1 less than it originally was or 1 more than it originally was. Following the coordinate plane system, if you make it a bigger number, it's going to be further to the right. Make it a smaller number, it'll be further to the left. I just noticed a typo in here too. I've got left arrow pressed twice. Make sure that that second one is right arrow. So that's a perfect example of why you shouldn't copy and paste code. Because technically, if you follow this code, it's going to say if your left arrow is pressed, move them to the right. If your left arrow is pressed, move them to the left. So it just kind of like cancels each other out, which means that if I hit anything, nothing would happen. So make sure to set that to right arrow is pressed. Right is on the bottom one. And hopefully you should be able to test it out, and you should have left and right arrow keys working now. If you want them to move faster or slower, you can change that value so it's not just plus or minus 1. You can do plus or minus, I think I'm doing like 5 for this thing. If you make it too big, you'll fly off the screen really fast. Okay, does anyone need help getting this far? Kyle, can you help out? Oh, come on. All right, so now using this same idea, you could basically create a variable for every single key on your keyboard to see if it's being pressed. Do not do this, okay? This is kind of a lot. The reason I'm saying this is because I went through for Husky Games and looked at all of their old video games, and I found stuff like this where someone put in every single key on your keyboard, set it to true or false, and it is horrible. There are much better ways of doing this, so do not make the same mistake that they did. So you guys probably hate arrays at this point, but they're very, very useful in games. So if you think about it, we could make an array for every single key, have them set to false, and then when you press a key, set that value to true. And when you release a key, set it to false. So if you guys remember, to set the index of our key, you would have to know like a position to set it. So like, how do we know that this value is Q and that this value is W? Well, luckily, the thing that's passed in, this key code, that's an integer. So we can use that as an index for our array. So what I mean by that is you can create an array of Booleans that corresponds to every single key on your keyboard. So if you go ahead and add these two lines, the reason I set this to 999 was just because it's a big number. Technically, I think it only has to be 256.
106.
Is it 106 for libgdx? Yeah, I know, but there's also ones that you can virtually press, like there's entertainment buttons and stuff like that.
Yeah,
I don't know the exact number. Oh, is it? Yeah, I don't know what libgdx is off the top of my head, but there's a better way of doing this, which I originally planned on covering, but this works well enough that I didn't get back to it. It doesn't cause a problem, but if you guys are curious, the better way to do this is usually using hash maps. So if you keep adding these lines of code, you've got your Boolean keys pressed. This is just an array of true and false, and you set that to a size that is some giant number. Apparently it only has to be like 106. But just set it to a big number so we don't have any problems for now. 999 is still really small for a computer, so you don't really have to worry about it. And now, if you guys remember, when we had the key down and key up, we had to check what key it was, and then we set our variable. Now, instead of checking, we can just set that specific spot in our array to true or false. Does that make sense? So yeah, if you press like the left arrow key, let's say that number is 50.
Yeah, just a little slower.
Okay.
Could you tell that array part again?
Yes. So this array is basically going to be a giant list of trues and falses. So if you make this to some big number, then it will cover every key on your keyboard. All right, so now the only problem is we need to be able to say, how do we know when you press like the Q button? How do we know which spot in the array that is? Well, when we're passing stuff in, this key code here is an integer. So that integer can be then used to point at a spot in the array. So we can use this as our index. So when you press Q, let's just say the number is some weird number. We'll just call it 50 for now. Then it would set position 50 to true. and then if you let go of Q, it would look at your key code and set position 50 to false. So then if we ever want to check if Q is pressed, we can look at position 50 in the array, and then it's either going to be true or false, whether or not it's
And
pressed.
is that position 50 is doing something?
That position is just relative to that key. So we're going to have, if you hit like 10 keys on your keyboard, then there will be 10 true values somewhere in that array. So this lets us know what button is being hit when. Does everything make sense, and is everyone caught up?
Which one is it?
He just needs to go through it. I would suggest getting the presentation.
Are you trouble? Or are you? You're good? Alright. He's good.
And then feel free to change that number bigger, smaller, whatever you want. All right. So the next thing, what was I doing here? Yeah, you guys can actually ignore this. We'll find a better way to do this. I'm actually going to modify this real quick, this presentation. No, I'm not, because that's a picture. If you go back to your jelly.java, this is going to be a little bit different. I decided to make a method for something, but it turns out to be a little easier if you don't have it. So before, where we had keyboard listener, I'll go back to the slide here. We have where left arrow is pressed and right arrow, ignore that typo. That's where we're going to execute something. So now we don't have those variables. You should have been able to delete them. Also, if there's any things that we stop doing and I say to delete something, I would suggest deleting it, because then it will give you errors if you forgot to take other parts out of your code that relied on those. So yeah, delete the variables up top here where we had those booleans, left arrow pressed and right arrow pressed. If you didn't already delete them now, because we will never use them again.
Same for the.
Yeah, a key is
down.
pressed. That can be destroyed as well. We don't need that. The reason that you delete them is so you don't have any weird bugs in your code later on. So then going back to this, where we had the dot left arrows pressed and right arrows pressed, now we can access our array of booleans. So this is our list. So now if we want to check if our left arrow is being pressed, instead of having that specific variable, we access this. So instead of is key pressed, this is, I should probably update these. Do keys pressed. So you should have if key listener dot keys pressed, then you will have square brackets, and then say keys dot left or keys dot right. I'm actually going to change this in here. have to make this a little bit smaller. Some beautiful editing here. Okay, so this is what your code should look like. Instead of having that variable that I had, we're just accessing that spot in the array. Might be a little small. Oh, I should probably make it full screen. Does everybody have this? That was my bad for not having it fixed. Yep.
And then what is that? Just
Just the part that was throwing the error. It was one of his classes where he had commented his thing saying deprecated. So he included his own thing, which was deprecated, but it's deprecated saying it's not good. Which it still is, but now the error's gone. Alright, so hopefully if you guys have that working, you should have the exact same thing as before. There should be no errors. The nice thing is now is you just made your potential unlimited. You can hit any key and access any key without having to change your code anymore. If you want to see if the A button is being pressed, now you can do that easily without having to make more variables and stuff. So make sure that you do not delete those methods that say is key up and is key down, because that's still in your listener what is executed whenever you press a key. So every time that you press a key, that is key pressed, or is key down, I mean, is executed, which then sets the variable in our array to true. When you release it, it sets it to false. And then outside of that, whenever we want to access it from our game, we can see what the value is. So hopefully everything made sense. That's all I had for today. I didn't think I was going to finish it that fast. If you guys are interested, we can start the next one. You probably won't be able to make it all the way through, but the next one is where it starts to actually turn into a video game. We started doing some really boring things here, which aren't very fun, but now we can control something and apply gravity, and that kind of opens up everything.
I don't know what the issue is. This is a very good lesson in why encapsulation is right now.
What was that?
We're right now, we're recording one.
So,
Yes.
in Java, there's two equals operators, right? Oh. One is about silent, the other is you don't have any variable. So, instead of, normally when you get an incentive means to make it something like that, it changes to work. So control space and now what we want is now we have and then here's you can change the is keyless equals true. If keyless